What would you say is the most important aspect of what makes a video game console successful? Many of us will say it's the quality of the graphics, the games, the multiplayer options, but I can tell you one factor that I hold dear and is extremely important to what makes a console great is the controller. There are plenty of controller options out there for your favorite system of choice, but to me, the official first-party controller pretty much sets the tone for what your experience will be with the console. There are always going to be third-party options out there, but a controller can have the power to literally make or break a console's success. I thought it'd be fun to take a look at some of my favorite video game controllers of all time, specifically first-party controllers, to take a look at some personal history behind them and just why they captivated my heart. So, kick back and relax, because on today's Level 10, we're going to take a look at my 10 favorite first-party video game controllers of all time. I'm G, and welcome to the next level. Starting off at number 10, it's the Nintendo GameCube controller, specifically the Wavebird wireless controller. One of the oddest controllers at a quick glance, the GameCube controller still wound up being the most charming controllers of that generation for me. Just like the system itself. Aww, isn't it cute? While yes, the button placement is a bit odd and the D-pad is kinda small, once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. The big green A and tiny B buttons threw me off at first impressions, but over time, I grew quite fond of the design. And the analog stick is a tremendous upgrade from the N64 controller's analog stick. Yeah, I know the N64 controller has its hardcore fans, but I just can't handle it. Okay. But the Wavebird is really the star here, being the first wireless analog controller to feel like the real deal. It's lightweight, super responsive, and has a very good battery life, so it's definitely worth tracking down one if you can. The GameCube controller did things a bit differently than most first-party efforts, which fits right in with Nintendo's style of innovating of how we play games. And speaking of innovating ways to play games, number 9, the Nintendo Wii U Gamepad. Yes folks, it counts. This one makes my list mostly because of the technology behind it. It's a tablet-style controller that's part of your console and has a colorful 6.2-inch touchscreen on it. It was way ahead of its time, and yeah, it was a tad gimmicky, but again, that's just kinda how Nintendo works. Their ambition was admirable, even if the console itself was a failure. But yes, the gamepad. Plenty of people have said that the gamepad is clunky, and I can see it being so for certain games depending on your playstyle. But overall, I think the Wii U was a great and sorely overlooked system together. How the touchscreen works with the different aspects of the game and have exclusive perks to the screen is really cool. The touchscreen is nice, the analog sticks and the trigger buttons feel great, and am I crazy y'all, or does the Wii U gamepad remind you an awful lot of the ASCII keyboard controller that came out in Japan? You know, the one that was made for Phantasy Star Online? It really makes you think that Phantasy Star Online really could have done well on the Wii U, right? In at number 8, it's a Neo Geo CD controller. Simply put, the D-pad on the Neo Geo CD controller is my favorite D-pad ever. There's just something so satisfying about the smooth click as you move the circular D-pad and perform complex fighting game maneuvers. It's hard to explain by just talking about it, but anyone who's used one, or maybe have played on the Neo Geo Pocket, which uses the same style of D-pad, they know exactly what I'm talking about. Beyond that, the controller has a nice feel and the face buttons are big, responsive, and well spaced apart. The curved nature of the grip feels just right in my hands without being too bulky. SNK even made a slightly modified version of their Neo Geo CD controller for the PlayStation 3, and I am dying to get one of these someday. They also brought it back for the Neo Geo Mini console, but I haven't gotten hands-on with one of those yet. I'd still like to someday though. I just picked up a Neo Geo CD system and I can't wait to dig into it, but for now, the controller is c'est magnifique. Number 7, the Nintendo Super Famicom controller. The Super Famicom controller is here just because it's a comfortable, solid controller. Perhaps the most overall solid controller I've ever felt. It was the first controller to introduce L and R shoulder buttons to me as a kid, and although I prefer a 6-button controller to have its buttons all on the front, we'll get to that a bit later. I also am aware that some people prefer the bottom of the controller to be flat, much like the original NES rectangular controller, but I like having more of a grippy feel to the bottom of my controllers. However, its D-pad is fantastic. Great for fighting games, the buttons in the build just feel super sturdy, and overall, it's top notch. It may not blow me away, but personally, I can totally see why it's a lot of people's favorite controller, so it definitely makes the list. Number 6, the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. Now this one came out of nowhere for me. I'll be honest here folks, after my wife and I combined our prize winnings from that gingerbread house competition in 2017, I haven't given the system nearly as much attention as I should until recently. But I will say that the Pro controller has been shockingly great. The somewhat soft matte handles of the controller feel so good in your hands, and while its D-pad isn't perfect, it's a much better alternative to the separated buttons of the Joy-Cons. I can actually play fighting games and old school shooters with this thing, and we all know that Switch is an old school shooter haven, so that sold me on it alone. I also appreciate the shoulder buttons being a bit larger and how they feel more responsive than the also fantastic Wii U Pro controller. It makes them much more easier to press. It may be a bit pricey, and let's face it, all the controllers of this generation are, but I was pleasantly surprised by how comfy the Switch Pro controller is, so good job, Nintendo. It may not be my favorite controller of this generation, but it's definitely worth owning if you have a Switch. Making its way into the top half of the list at number 5, it's the Sony DualShock 3 controller. Out of the entire first-party family of PlayStation controllers, it was really hard for me to pick which one was my favorite, but in the end, my vote goes to the DualShock 3. While it may not be too different in design from its previous iterations aside from Bluetooth wireless connection and the thankfully abandoned 6-axis motion controls, the DualShock 3 overall is one of the most comfortable designs and the best D-pads of any controller out there. The weightiness is pretty spot on, and I still prefer the analog sticks being parallel to each other, with some exceptions of course. As for why I chose the DualShock 3 over the newer DualShock 4, well, it's because of the DualShock 4's lackluster battery life and my tendency to accidentally press the option button during gameplay. I have big thumbs, alright? I'm sure some of you out there feel my pain here. But overall, the DualShock 3 is fantastic. It just feels the best out of the whole family of controllers with funny shapes for buttons. At number 4 is the Sega Genesis 6-button controller. Ah, you probably thought this would top the list, didn't you? Well, it might not be the champ, but I love the Genesis, or Mega Drive, 6-button controller all the same. Like I mentioned, as someone with big hands, I should favor the original 3-button Genesis controller, and while, yeah, it's iconic, you pretty much need the 6-button controller for many titles on the system, so that alone gets it the nod. Beyond that, the curved boomerang design is really nice to hold in your hands. The D-pad feels less stiff than the original 3-button, and I really like the outward feel of the X, Y, and Z buttons on top. The spacing and the familiar Sega upward curve of the buttons feel right at home for me here, and taking my own personal nostalgia out of it, it just feels wonderful for platformers. There also was a second version of the 6-button Genesis controller that came with the Majesco budget model Genesis 3 system. It's a little smaller and adds toggle switches for slow motion and rapid fire. Unfortunately, this variant is a bit too small for my hands to be comfy. And yes, the new officially licensed Retrobit 6-button controllers, they're pretty great as well. Boasting a sleek look that fits right in with Sega's attitude and a super comfortable feel, the Genesis 6-button will always have a close place in my heart. At number 3, it's the NES Dogbone controller. The controller that came with the slimmer, lighter, top-loading revision of Nintendo's 8-bit juggernaut, the Dogbone controller, as it's been dubbed by fans, has its share of criticisms throughout the years, but I personally love it. Remember how I said earlier that I'm not a fan of controllers with flat backs? That probably is the biggest reason why I prefer the Dogbone. The curved grip of it feels much better in my hands than the square boxed-off edges of the original NES controller. But the more debatable design changes to it is the angle of the B and A buttons. I've heard so many people complain about why Nintendo chose to angle the face buttons upward, but for me, this was a great move. As someone who got a top-loading NES way later than its initial release, my time with the Genesis controllers really made the button alignment of the Dogbone feel right at home. I just play NES games better with this button layout like that. I even went and bought the Hyperkin controller attachment for the NES Classic just so I could use my Dogbone controller on it. I can understand why people don't care for this iteration of the NES controller compared to the original, but seeing as how the NES is my favorite Nintendo system, might as well play it with my favorite Nintendo controller. Getting the runner-up spot at number 2, it's the Microsoft Xbox One controller. And here is the dark horse, one that I would have never thought would become one of my favorite controllers, let alone be near the top of this list. It seems like with every new system Microsoft puts out for their systems, they get better and better controllers and they're more comfortable, and the Xbox One controller just nails it for me. It's super comfy, feels just right in my hands. I love the half-clicky feel of the D-pad and its buttons. The weight feels perfect, and just like the Xbox 360 controller, it uses either rechargeable battery packs or AA batteries, which is a huge plus for me. I've already mentioned the weak battery life of the DualShock 4 controller, and using the official Xbox One rechargeable battery gets you a much longer battery life than Sony's DualShock 4. As someone who leans more towards PlayStation, I always thought that the Xbox and the Xbox 360 controllers were solid, but they didn't wow me. Because of it, now I see myself leaning towards getting a game for Xbox One if it's available on both consoles. And there are so many color options too. Many of them are absolutely glorious. Don't like any of them? Then go online and make your own. You can even engrave it. Now that is awesome. I still prefer PS4 as a whole, but I can't really deny the kudos that Microsoft deserves for making the Xbox One controller just shockingly awesome. If they keep this design when moving into the next generation of consoles, I'll keep tipping my hat to Microsoft for a job well done. Before we find out what controller tops this list, I have a very special honorable mention. One controller that I know has a lot of animosity, but I actually have a real soft spot for. This is the Microsoft Duke controller for the original Xbox. You want to talk infamous controllers? This beefy beast was the original pack-in for the Xbox back in 2001 and was designed after consumer testing from American audiences. Okay. It gets a lot of hate, widely regarded as one of the worst controllers of all time, but aside from the awkward white and black button placement and the squishy D-pad, I kinda like it. It certainly isn't for everyone, but as ridiculous as it is, I feel that the Duke gets way too much hate nowadays. So if you have larger hands and are a fan of the OG Xbox, then maybe you should take home a Duke. And yes, I will be getting the Xbox One Hyperkin Duke controller in due time. And taking the gold medal in the top spot at number 1, it's the Sega Saturn Model 2 controller. The creme de la creme of controllers for me, the Saturn Model 2 controller is simply my favorite and the most comfortable controller I have ever held. I could possibly describe the Saturn Model 2 controller like a cross between the Genesis 6 button and the Dualshock 3, with the face buttons and the D-pad style of the Genesis, but a similar grip and feel to the Dualshock line controllers. The buttons feel almost just like the ones on the Genesis with the D-pad and a similar arc, and the L and R buttons, while they're a bit clicky, also feel responsive and they're just great. I love the semi-rough feel to it. Not too soft, but not too rough, and the lightweight makes it easy to pick up and use for all hand shapes and sizes. This could very well be the best controller that I've ever used for TD games, and since the Saturn is a 2D powerhouse, it only makes sense for it to be that good. Especially if you're playing any of the Capcom arcade fighting games on the system. The design and feel is absolutely beautiful and goes right along with the whole galaxy outer space vibe that Sega was going for at that time. Hey, if Ice Cube can't convince you that this is the greatest controller of all time, what chance do I have? The Saturn was a wonderful system that was unfortunately cursed by bad marketing, company infighting, and just poor timing. But I'm not talking about the system today. I'm talking about the personal takeaway that I have from that sadly overlooked system, and that is that it's home to my favorite controller ever. Cheers to you, Model 2, as you're my favorite controller of all time. But hey, at the end of the day, any controller can be someone's favorite, even if someone else may hate it. Like a good pair of jeans, it's all about what fits you best. That same pair may not be your fit, but to someone else out there, it's their best ever. So yeah, those are my 10 favorite first-party video game controllers of all time, and I know that it might be different than some of your favorites, so talk to me. Let me know in the comments what are some of your favorite controllers of all time. Do you have a specific reason why? Let me know. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and you can talk to me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at G2TheNextLevel. Keep on gaming, and keep being awesome. I'm G, and I'll see you on the next level.